Hello, welcome to our first science sip of 2023.
Yay, 2023 and science sipping.
Oh, you always cheers before I'm ready to. I always have like a little spiel and then you're like, let's get to the drinks.
Let's just straight to the drinks. I love this. It looks like a great drink.
I have a very classic champagne cocktail today. So it's champagne and Angostura bitters and a little bit of sugar.
Oh, wow. And it tastes great.
Thanks. I thought it would be appropriate to celebrate the first science sip with some bubbly.
Absolutely. And the new year.
Yes, and the new year. So we are going to do something a little bit different today for our science sip. We thought it would be really fun to delve into a little bit more of the science that we didn't have time for in our most recent podcast episode.
Yep.
So we have been coloring paint pigments for the past 4 episodes.
Yes.
And in every episode, there's been a poisonous paint. And so we are going to be talking a little bit more about those poisons and why and how they're toxic to humans. So, Dimos, do you want to start us off with lead poisoning?
Yes,
because there were a lot of lead pigments. Lead white, lead yellow.
Lead red.
Lead red. There you go. See?
And one of the things that we found was that lead poisoning was the most well-known of all the paints, or lead paints was most well-known of all the sources of lead poisoning, to the point of buying a house across the country requires testing the paint for lead and then disclosing it on a real estate form.
Yes.
So we find out that in a little bit of research that people have been mining and using lead for thousands of years, potentially even since 6,500 BC. The ability to make lead into tools and pots and pipes is one of the reasons that the Romans were using it to move water through aqueducts in their city. Some people have even opined that the fall of Rome was because of the lead pipes.
Well, it's also been postulated that Napoleon died of arsenic poisoning, but
yeah,
that's still up for debate.
It is, and they're still debating even what really did lead to the fall of Rome. But
I'm going to vote for hubris.
Hubris, yes. Now, if hubris is caused by some of the neurological issues of lead poisoning, well, that may very well be true. Here in the U.S., there were actually 2 major sources of lead, potential lead poisoning, and one was lead paints, which were acceptable and allowed to be sold in the U.S. until 1971.
That's pretty recent.
It is pretty recent, especially given that the rest of the world knew about this, starting with Australia in 1897.
Yes.
And that lead paints were banned everywhere else except the U.S. until 1922. So, along with that, one of the things we found is that lead paints have been associated with exposure to toxicity. In the U.S., we've also had leaded gasoline.
It's true, yeah.
Which,
that was up until the 70s too, right?
Actually, even up until the mid-'80s. Because I remember having the choice of filling up with lead or unleaded. It was so much a part of the country's lore that when you would go to a diner and order a coffee, the waitress would ask you, would you like it leaded or unleaded?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That was also when you were still smoking inside too.
Yes, that's right. So we were doing a lot of really dangerous things. And
the 80s were a
smoking
great
cigarettes, by the way, is another way to get metals into your body. But
Gotta love being 80s babies.
it was a dangerous time to be an 80s baby. One of the things that we find with lead exposure is that a variety of things like ADD, attention deficit disorder, and antisocial behavior have been linked to lead. Also, earlier exposure to lead can actually lead to irreversible brain damage. Wow. And lead-polluted air has been linked with violent crime and murder rates, even adjusting for socioeconomic factors in countries that have heavily polluted air with lead in it.
Interesting.
So, however, we still see lead used in places like Bangladesh as a pigment in turmeric.
That you're going to eat. Turmeric you're going to eat, right?
Yes, to make it more yellow. It's believed to have started in the 1980s and continues as of right before the pandemic. So whether it continues to be still the case, we don't know, but it's one of the main sources of high lead levels in Bangladesh. So we talked a little bit about how lead paints were made illegal.
Yes.
And so that was a good thing, but it's only been since they weren't fully banned actually until 1978.
Right.
And so up even to this day, if you buy an older home, chances are you've got lead. And since we've been covering lead in our podcast,
Yes.
we know that's indeed ubiquitous. I'll talk just a tiny bit about how it works in the brain. The brain is the most sensitive organ to lead exposure, even though in adults it ends up in your hair, your nails, and your bones.
Yes, that's one of the ways to test for it.
Exactly. And lead is able to pass through endothelial cells in the blood-brain barrier. And the reason is that it anything that has the ability to do electrical, like ionize as I believe as an ion, it can pass through, like as a substitute for calcium ions, for example, which can also pass through the blood-brain barrier. Lead poisoning interferes with the normal development of a child's brain and nervous system and can create neurotoxicity in adults. However, in a developing brain, it interferes with synapse formation and in the cerebral cortex and neurochemical development. And I'm assuming that's probably where sort of that ability to moderate behaviors comes from.
Yeah.
And can cause neurons' myelin sheaths to be damaged and eliminated, which would obviously damage and reduce neurons. So that is some of the research on lead. I also, just for quick final statement, and then you can add more science as needed. I wanted to compare how much lead comes out of coal emissions, which is one of the other remaining major sources of lead pollution. And there's a paper actually just published in 2020 about the pollution of from China's coal power plants.
Oh, okay.
China's the largest coal burning country in the world, so I think it's fair to use them as a benchmark for coal output.
Yeah.
The paper was actually dated from 2009, or I believe it was 2009, and what they had stated is at that time 400 kilograms of lead was emitted into the air.
That's a lot of lead.
Yes. However, 400 kilograms a lot, yeah, and it's all in very tiny powder forms, you can imagine. But in terms of mercury, and this is where I kind of sort of leave it back to you, throw it back at you. An earlier study in the U.S. at the turn of 1999, 2000 had 48 tons of mercury being emitted into the air. So 48 tons. That's 48 times 2,000. So it's 100,000 pounds.
It's a lot of.
Yeah.
It's a lot of mercury.
Or 50,000 kilograms.
So yeah, so I'm going to be talking about mercury poisoning, and this was in the most recent episode that we just uploaded. Vermilion is a pigment, is made of cinnabar, and cinnabar is a mercuric sulfide. This is what you would call it. So for mercury poisoning, some symptoms are muscle weakness, numbness, poor coordination, memory problems, trouble speaking, trouble hearing, trouble sleeping, and decreased intelligence. In fact, the saying "as mad as a hatter" is probably due to mercury poisoning, because back in the 1900s, the felt that was used for hats by milliners was made with mercury. And so they had a lot of mercury exposure, and so that's what the thought is. One origin of the saying "as mad as a hatter" comes from the mercury poisoning.
Did they form the hats by actually having a huge bath of mercury that they would use to then punch the hats into to get?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No, it was just the felt.
Okay.
So how does mercury impact your body? So this depends a little bit on the type of mercury you're exposed to. So there's elemental mercury, which is just the element in its pure form. Mercury can also form salts, which I think mercuric sulfide is a salt. And it could also form more organic compounds, such as ethyl or methyl mercuries. And it's the methyl mercuries that are particularly hazardous because they bioaccumulate, and so they stay in your body. And so if a shrimp gets one and then something gets lots of shrimps, all that mercury is now in that little fish. And then if a big fish eats a littler fish, and it just keeps going up the food chain, which is why big fish like tuna are a problem for mercury exposure.
For people who want to eat fish should not eat tuna.
Not that often.
Yeah.
So what does it do in your body? So mercury compounds irreversibly inhibit selenoenzymes like thioredoxin reductase. So as a reminder, enzymes are proteins that speed up a chemical reaction in your body. Selenoenzymes catalyze the reaction that restores antioxidant molecules back to their reduced forms. So all that means is that you have antioxidants in your body, which everyone's heard of. It's apparently like the fountain of youth. The more purple things you eat, the better you are, right? And they are responsible for neutralizing radical oxygen species. So radical oxygen species happen because we use oxygen as part of our cellular respiration, and when you oxidize something, you end up with what's called a free radical, or a ROS.
And that can kill cells.
Reactive oxygen species, yes. And they can damage cells. So you have these enzymes, these selenoenzymes that catalyze this reaction that helps protect your body from these radical oxygen species. And you have mercury, which inhibits that enzyme. So essentially what you're doing is letting these reactive oxygen species run rampant in your body without a lot of protection. Much as with lead poisoning, mercury poisoning is more acute in the brain because your brain is the largest consumer of oxygen because it's doing the most work in your body. And so you need a lot of those antioxidants in your brain. And so when you don't have it, you don't have the ability to neutralize those reactive oxygen species, you can get irreversible DNA damage. So, but also methylmercury specifically causes an increase in antibodies to the proteins that form part of your central nervous system, like those myelin sheaths that you were talking about. Yeah. And so now you have an autoimmune response to portions of your central nervous system, which is never a good thing.
No, it's a terrible thing.
So you can see why a lot of the symptoms for mercury poisoning are brain or nervous system type of symptoms: inability to speak clearly, confusion, stumbling, going mad. Now, important side note: there's been a lot of controversy about the use of thimerosal as a vaccine preservative.
Oh, really?
So there's been a lot of stuff on the internet that this is mercury and it's going to poison your kids, all that stuff. So thimerosal is a mercury-based preservative, and it was used in the US for medicines and vaccines. It has stopped being used as of 2001, especially for childhood vaccines. So if you're vaccinating your children now, there is no exposure.
And there would have been a very small amount of it even before 2000.
Yes, but the key with thimerosal is that it's an ethyl mercury. And ethyl mercury is cleared from your body much more quickly than methyl mercury is. Okay. And so it doesn't bioaccumulate, and it's much less likely to do any harm. So you can still get vaccinated. It's fine. You can't use the mercury excuse, especially now because it's not even in it anymore, right? And to treat acute mercury toxicity, you would do a chelation therapy.
Yeah, same as for lead.
Yeah, so most of these, lead, arsenic, mercury, any heavy metal poisoning, you can use a chelation therapy. And chelating agents essentially provide a specific binding site for metals, and the metals bind and they form a precipitate that is more easily removed, either from the body, or it's also a way to purify water. Yeah. And there's other uses for chelation.
And that's one example of where it's better to not be part of the solution.
It's much rather be the precipitate in that case. Actually, no, it's better to be part of the solution because the metals would have precipitated out, and now the solution is pure and clear. Still better to be part of the solution. Still better to be part of the solution. So we hope that is a little interesting side note to our podcast about all the toxic paints that we've been talking about. We talked about arsenic in the podcast, and then we just did lead and mercury, which are probably the two. I suppose chromium is probably another.
Yeah. But talk about cocktail topics. But who hasn't had a serious cocktail topic? I've had many serious cocktail topics.
I mean, by the nature of my work, I've had a lot of cocktail topics about vaccines.
Yeah, exactly.
So
but it was good. I learned a lot.
I think it's very fascinating to understand what these what these elements do to your body. But much better to avoid them altogether.
Yeah, absolutely.
But not by not taking your vaccines. You can still do that.
Well, cheers to that.
#vaccines work.
Vaccine.